Gunfire chewed through the canyon walls, trapping 32 Navy SEALs in a blood-soaked kill zone. Command called it a lost cause. No rescue, no air support. But one woman, a SEAL who refused to let her brothers die, climbed into the cockpit of a scrapped A-10 Warthog to wage a one-woman war. The Shock Valley was a place where light went to die and ambushes were born. For the 32 operators of Navy SEAL Team 4, it was supposed to be a surgical strike, a ghost operation. Get in under the cover of a moonless night extract, a high-value insurgent financier hiding in a fortified compound, and vanish before the surrounding militia even knew they were there. Intelligence had promised a light footprint, maybe 20 fighters poorly armed and undisciplined. Intelligence had been fatally wrong. At 02:14 hours, the mountainside erupted. Master Chief David Wheeler barely had time to shout a warning before the first rocket-propelled grenade obliterated the lead transport vehicle, sending a shockwave of heat and shrapnel through the narrow ravine. Suddenly, the cliffs on all three sides of the SEALs were alive with muzzle flashes. It wasn't 20 fighters. It was a coordinated, heavily entrenched battalion of over 300 insurgents, armed with DSHK, heavy machine guns, mortars, and a vantage point that turned the valley floor into a meat grinder. Contact, front and elevated. Os andados tes dos, yelled Petty Officer First Class Ryan O'Connor, his voice barely cutting through the deafening roar of overlapping gunfire. He dumped a magazine from his Mark 48 machine gun into the darkness, aiming at the flashes. Beside him, Brody Sullivan went down hard, clutching a gaping wound in his shoulder. "I'm hit, damn it, I'm hit! Hold the line! Consolidate on the rocks!" Wheeler bellowed, dragging Sullivan behind a cluster of jagged boulders that offered the only meager protection in the kill zone. Dust and stone chips rained down on them as heavy-caliber rounds chewed the rocks to powder. They were pinned, 32 men trapped in a fishbowl taking fire from three sides. 40 miles away at Forward Operating Base, Fiddler's Green Lieutenant Cassandra Mitchell stood rigid inside the Tactical Operations Center, TOC. Cassie was an anomaly in the military world, a living legend whispered about in mess halls. She had started her career in the Air Force, flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the legendary Warthog, racking up hundreds of combat hours providing close air support. But Cassie was restless, driven by a primal need to be on the ground in the mud with the door kickers. Against impossible odds, bureaucratic red tape, and grueling physical barriers, she had cross-trained entering the Navy and surviving Bades to become one of the very first female Navy SEALs. She was supposed to be in that valley. A piece of jagged shrapnel from a raid 2 weeks prior had sidelined her, leaving her grounded at the FOB while her brothers deployed without her. Inside the TOC, the radio was a symphony of chaos. The panicked voice of Wyatt Hughes, the team's communications operator, echoed from the speakers. Any station. This is Viper Actual. We are surrounded. Taking heavy casualties. 3 KIA, 8 severely wounded. We need immediate air support, over. Captain Robert Cole. The base commander stared at the topographic map on the glowing screens, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might fracture. Viper Actual, this is Havoc Base. Weather is deteriorating. We have a massive dust storm moving into your grid, and ISR confirms 3 SA-7 surface-to-air missile sites active on the ridges above you. We cannot push birds into that sector. Repeat, all air assets are grounded. Cassie pushed past the intel analysts, her eyes blazing as she stepped up to the commander's console. Captain Cole, they are being slaughtered. If we don't send air, they'll be overrun in less than 30 minutes. I know the math. Mitchell Cole snapped, not breaking eye contact with the map. But sending a QRF or helicopters into a zero-visibility storm with active anti-air is suicide. We'd just be adding more bodies to the count. I will not authorize a rescue mission that is doomed to fail. We have to wait for the storm to break. By the time the storm breaks, they'll be dead. Cassie slammed her hand on the desk. Let me take a bird. I know that valley. I can fly under the radar ceiling. No, Cole said coldly. The Apaches are grounded. The F-16s are grounded. It's an order, Lieutenant. Stand down. On the radio, Hughes's voice cracked. Havoc base, they're maneuvering to flank us. We're going black on ammo. If you don't send the cavalry now, tell our families we went down fighting. The TOC fell dead silent, save for the static and the distant, agonizing pop of gunfire over the open comms. Cassie looked at the faces of the officers in the room. They had already written Team 4 off. They were listening to ghosts. Cassie turned on her heel and walked out of the command center, the heavy blast doors shutting behind her. She wasn't going to stand down. Outside, the wind was already howling, whipping coarse sand across the tarmac of FOB Fiddler's Green. The floodlights cast long, eerie shadows across the flight line, where rows of multi-million-dollar aircraft sat chained down, grounded by the impending storm. Cassie sprinted toward the far end of the runway, her mind racing, calculating the impossible. The base had no viable aircraft, but she knew what was sitting in Hangar 4, banished to the military graveyard, awaiting salvage parts. Tail number 81-0964. An A-10 Thunderbolt II that had limped back to base 3 weeks ago after a disastrous escort mission. As she pushed open the hangar doors, there it was, the ghost ship. The right engine cowl was blown wide open, blackened by fire. Its hydraulic lines had been bled, half its avionics was stripped out for other jets, and the canopy was cracked. It was a metal carcass, a death trap. Master Sergeant Gregory Miller, the lead maintenance chief, was sitting on a crate nearby, polishing a wrench. He looked up, startled, as Cassie marched toward the cockpit ladder, hauling her tactical gear and a heavy flight helmet she'd swiped from the locker room. "Lieutenant Mitchell, what the hell are you doing?" Miller asked, standing up. "I need this bird, Greg," Cassie said, not breaking stride as she began climbing the yellow ladder. "Are you out of your mind?" Miller rushed over, grabbing the bottom rung of the ladder. "That hog is dead. The starboard engine is hanging on by a prayer. The targeting computer is a brick, and we stripped the redundant hydraulics on Tuesday. If you start that thing, it'll likely explode on the tarmac. 32 of my brothers are bleeding out in the shock valley right now," Cassie said, pausing to look down at the veteran mechanic. "Command abandoned them. The Apaches abandoned them. I am not abandoning them. Now you can either step back, or you can help me hotwire this piece of junk." Miller stared at her, the reality of her words sinking in. He looked at the battered A-10, then back to the fierce determination in Cassie's eyes. "The 30mm Avenger cannon is still loaded from the last run," he muttered, shaking his head. 400 rounds of depleted uranium, but you won't have a targeting reticle. It's all manual. Stick and rudder. You're flying blind, Cassie." "Good thing I don't miss," she said, swinging herself into the cockpit. The inside of the A-10 smelled of stale sweat, aviation fuel, and burnt wiring. Cassie strapped herself into the ejection seat, her fingers flying over the instrument panel with the muscle memory of a past life. Half the gauges were dead. The screens were black. Suddenly the hangar bay doors rattled. The harsh wail of military police sirens cut through the wind. Captain Cole had realized she was missing. "Mitchell!" Cole's voice barked over the base frequency, crackling to life in her headset. "Base security is inbound. Step away from that aircraft immediately. You are violating direct orders. You will be arrested and court-martialed. Acknowledge." Cassie reached up and flipped the master power switch. A low whine began to build, followed by a violent shudder that shook the entire airframe. Miller, clear the chocks! Cassie yelled over the noise. The Master Sergeant hesitated for only a fraction of a second before diving under the wheels, pulling the heavy rubber chocks away. He gave her a frantic salute and sprinted for cover. Cassie initiated the auxiliary power unit and hit the ignition for the left engine. It screamed to life, blowing a cloud of dust out of the hangar. Then she prayed and hit the ignition for the damaged right engine. The engine coughed, sputtered, and emitted a terrifying bang that sounded like a shotgun going off in a metal trash can. Black smoke poured from the rear, but incredibly the turbine caught. The RPMs slowly climbed. The whole jet vibrated violently, threatening to shake itself to pieces before it even moved. 2 MP Humvees skidded to a halt outside the hangar, soldiers pouring out, waving their arms. Cassie didn't look at them. She pushed the twin throttles forward. The heavily armored A-10 lurched out of the hangar, its massive GAU-8 rotary cannon leading the way like the snout of a mechanical beast. Mitchell, I swear to God, if you take off, you are throwing your life and your career away. Cole screamed through the headset. My career isn't worth 32 men, Captain, Cassie replied coolly. She reached up and clicked her radio off, severing the connection to command. She taxied onto the main runway, ignoring the flashing lights of the security vehicles trying to intercept her. The dust storm had finally arrived, dropping visibility to less than 50 feet. It was a swirling wall of brown, choking sand. Flying in this was suicide. Flying a broken, unbalanced A-10 in this was madness. Cassie took a deep breath, picturing Master Chief Wheeler, Sullivan, and O'Connor pinned down in the dark. She slammed the throttles to the firewall. The damaged right engine whined in protest, fighting the thrust of the left, forcing Cassie to stomp on the rudder pedals just to keep the jet tracking straight down the runway. The airspeed indicator flickered 80 knots, 100 knots, 130 knots. The runway was disappearing into the storm. The frame rattled so hard Cassie's teeth clattered together. With seconds to spare before she ran out of asphalt, she pulled back on the stick. The Warthog tore away from the earth, plunging directly into the heart of the blinding sandstorm. Inside the cockpit, the turbulence was catastrophic. The jet was thrown left and right, fighting the brutal crosswinds. Red warning lights illuminated the dark cockpit like a Christmas tree screaming about hydraulic failures and engine temperature spikes. Cassie fought the stick, relying purely on her inner ear and the digital compass that was miraculously still functioning. She had to stay low below the mountain peaks and beneath the radar ceiling of the insurgent anti-air missiles. For 20 agonizing minutes, she flew totally blind, a ghost ship tearing through the tempest. The mechanical groans of the aircraft were a constant reminder that her wings could snap at any second. Then the storm broke. Cassie burst through the wall of dust, the black, jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush suddenly appearing in her cracked canopy. She banked hard, feeling the sickening loss of hydraulic pressure in her right wing, but forced the jet level. Below her, nestled in the deep ravine of the Shock Valley, the darkness was illuminated by a terrifying sight. Hundreds of green and red tracer rounds were crisscrossing the valley floor, all converging on a tiny, isolated pocket of boulders. The SEALs were taking their last stand, and the Warthog had arrived. Down in the dirt of the Shock Valley, Master Chief David Wheeler shoved a fresh magazine into his M4, his hand slick with his own blood. The perimeter was rapidly collapsing. What started as a 30-yard circle of defense had shrunk to a cluster of boulders barely 10 yards wide. Russo, status on Sullivan. Wheeler barked, leaning out to fire a 3-round burst at a muzzle flash on the eastern ridge. He's fading, boss, shouted Petty Officer Second Class Dominic Russo, the team's medic. Russo was desperately pressing a combat gauze into the junctional wound on Sullivan's neck, his own body shielding the wounded operator from the relentless rain of rock fragments. I'm out of tourniquets and we're black on morph. We need a medevac 10 minutes ago. There is no medevac, muttered Sniper Kyle Donovan, his voice eerily calm as he cycled the bolt of his Mark 13 rifle. He hadn't missed a shot all night, but for every insurgent he dropped, 3 more took their place. They're massing in the tree line to the north. Looks like a final assault element. 50, maybe 60 fighters. When they push, they'll overrun us. Wheeler knew it was true. They were down to their sidearms and the last of their primary ammunition. He looked at the faces of his men, grimy, bleeding, exhausted, but resolute. They were Navy SEALs. They would make the enemy pay for every inch of ground in blood. Fix bayonets, draw sidearms. Nobody dies with a round left in their chamber. Wheeler ordered his voice steady. He reached for his radio to broadcast their final transmission, a broken arrow call, meant to call in indiscriminate artillery on their own position to take the enemy with them. But before Wheeler could key the mic, the earth began to vibrate. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of mortars. It was a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the mountains. A shadow eclipsed the ambient light of the tracer fire. 200 feet above the valley floor, Lieutenant Cassie Mitchell ripped the A-10 Warthog out of the darkness. The jet was a battered asymmetrical nightmare, leaking hydraulic fluid and trailing a thick plume of black smoke from its starboard engine. But to the men on the ground, it was the chariot of the gods. Inside the cockpit, Cassie was wrestling a mechanical beast. With the targeting computer completely dead, her heads-up display HUD was a blank piece of glass. She had to rely on a greasy grease pencil crosshair drawn on the canopy by some mechanic months ago, and her own lethal intuition. She spotted the massive concentration of muzzle flashes in the northern tree line. The insurgents were standing up, screaming battle cries, preparing to charge the SEALs. Cassie kicked the rudder pedals, yawing the nose of the A-10 directly toward the insurgent mass. She flipped the master arm switch. "Say hello to the ghost," she whispered, and squeezed the trigger on the flight stick. The GAU-8/A, Avenger rotary cannon, spun to life. It didn't fire like a normal machine gun. It operated with the sheer catastrophic force of a chainsaw tearing through solid steel. A stream of 30mm depleted uranium shells, each the size of a milk bottle, lashed out from the nose of the aircraft at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The recoil was so massive it physically slowed the jet's airspeed. Down below, the insurgent charge evaporated in a blinding flash of kinetic energy. The tree line simply ceased to exist. Boulders shattered into dust. Trees were vaporized into splinters. The concussive shockwave knocked Wheeler and his men flat on their backs. 3 seconds later, the deafening, unearthly roar of the cannon finally reached their ears, a terrifying sound that sent a primal wave of fear through the surviving enemy fighters. "What in God's name is that?" O'Connor screamed over the din, staring up at the sky. "It's a hog!" Wheeler yelled, a massive grin splitting his bloodied face. "I don't know how, I don't know who, but we have air support. Paint the targets. Light them up with lasers." In the cockpit, Cassie pulled back hard on the stick, her body compressed into the seat by brutal G-forces, as she narrowly cleared the jagged peak of the mountain. Red warning alarms blared continuously in her ears. The hydraulic pressure was plummeting. The flight controls were getting sluggish, forcing her to rely on the A-10's manual reversion flight control system, a backup network of pure steel cables and pulleys that required immense physical strength to operate. She banked hard for a second pass, but the element of surprise was gone. The insurgent commander, realizing this, was a lone, crippled aircraft, and not an entire squadron, ordered his heavy weapons teams to redirect their fire. As Cassie dove back into the valley, the sky lit up. A barrage of 12.7mm rounds from a DSK anti-aircraft gun tore through the Warthog's left wing. The armored tub surrounding the cockpit, the titanium bathtub, rang out like a giant bell as heavy caliber rounds slammed into the metal inches from Cassie's boots. Then the radar warning receiver screamed to life. A high-pitched, frantic tone, missile launch. An insurgent had fired an SA-7 man-portable heat-seeking missile from the eastern ridge. "Flares, flares!" Cassie yelled, slamming her thumb onto the countermeasures button. Nothing happened. Master Sergeant Miller had been right. The hangar crew had stripped the defensive countermeasure dispensers. She had no flares. She was in a flying coffin, painting a massive infrared target with her burning right engine. Cassie had less than 3 seconds to react. She couldn't outrun it. She had to outfly it. Gritting her teeth, she rolled the A-10 inverted and yanked the stick into her lap. The jet plummeted into a vertical dive, screaming directly toward the rocky floor of the valley. The missile tracked her accelerating. At the very last possible microsecond, Cassie stomped the left rudder and pulled up, dragging the A-10 into a violent, gut-wrenching turn around a massive stone outcropping. The heat-seeking missile lost its line of sight, confused by the sudden maneuver and the heat of the rock wall. It slammed into the cliff face, detonating in a brilliant fireball that showered the valley in flaming debris. Cassie leveled out, gasping for air, her arms burning from the physical exertion of fighting the mechanical controls. But the evasive maneuver had cost her dearly. The shrapnel from the missile explosion had shredded the Warthog's right tail fin. The jet was dying. "Havoc Base, this is Viper Actual." Wheeler's voice crackled through Cassie's emergency guard frequency. He was broadcasting in the blind, hoping the mysterious pilot could hear him. "To the hog above us, God bless you. But they are bringing up a recoilless rifle on the southern ridge. If they set it up, they will wipe us off this mountain. We are too pinned down to engage. Can you assist?" Cassie looked at her fuel gauge. She was bleeding JP-8 jet fuel from a dozen holes. The right engine was coughing violently, shooting tongues of flame. She had maybe 2 minutes of flight time left before the aircraft fell out of the sky. She could eject. She could pull the handle blast out of the cockpit and parachute into the darkness, hoping to evade capture. But down there were 32 brothers. Her brothers. Cassie didn't reach for the ejection handle. She gripped the throttles, her knuckles turning white. "Viper Actual! This is Ghost Rider!" Cassie transmitted her voice, tight but unwavering. "I see the target. Keep your heads down. I'm coming in hot." Down in the perimeter, Wheeler froze. He recognized that voice. Mitchell. Wheeler breathed, utterly stunned. "Cassie, you're flying that thing." "Told you I'd cover your 6, boss," she replied. "Danger close. Duck." Cassie brought the Warthog around for one final suicidal run. She dropped the landing gear intentionally, using the massive tires to create drag and slow her descent, giving her more time to aim. Through the cracked canopy, she spotted the insurgent heavy weapons team on the southern ridge, frantically assembling the SPG-9 recoilless rifle. If they fired a high-explosive anti-tank round into the SEAL's boulder cluster, there would be nothing left but pink mist and dust. She squeezed the trigger. The entire airframe violently shuddered. Brrr, APPP. The last 200 rounds of depleted uranium tore out of the cannon. The southern ridge exploded. The recoilless rifle, the weapons team, and the rock beneath them were obliterated in a horrific storm of dust and fragmented stone. But as the gun ran dry, a horrific grinding noise tore through the Warthog. The starboard engine completely seized the turbine blades, shattering and ripping through the engine casing. A massive fireball engulfed the right side of the aircraft. With all asymmetric thrust gone, and the tail damaged, the A-10 violently rolled to the right. Cassie lost all pitch and roll control. The ground was rushing up to meet her at 140 miles an hour. "Mayday, Mayday going down," Cassie said calmly into the mic. She braced for impact. The A-10 Thunderbolt II didn't crash. It plowed. The jet slammed into the dry riverbed at the bottom of the valley, the reinforced titanium belly screaming as it ground against the rocks. The landing gear snapped off instantly. A massive rooster tail of dirt, sparks, and crushed stone erupted behind the aircraft as it skidded forward, propelled by its immense weight. It was sliding directly toward the insurgent front lines. The remaining enemy fighters shrieked in terror, dropping their weapons and scattering as 30 tons of flaming, screeching metal plowed through their positions like a mechanical avalanche. The jet tore through trenches, flattened a makeshift barricade, and finally slammed side-on into a massive embankment, coming to a violent, shuddering halt just 50 yards from the SEAL's perimeter. Silence descended on the valley, save for the crackling of flames from the downed jet. For an agonizing 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then the canopy of the A-10 was violently kicked open. Lieutenant Cassie Mitchell climbed out of the smoke, coughing, her face covered in soot and blood from a gash on her forehead. She didn't look back at the burning wreck. She unholstered her Sig Sauer P226, grabbed a spare M4 rifle from the aircraft's survival kit, and began sprinting across the open ground toward the boulder cluster. A lone insurgent popped up from the rocks, raising an AK-47 toward her. Without breaking stride, Cassie raised the M4 and fired a double tap, dropping him instantly. She slid into the SEAL's perimeter, kicking up a cloud of dust, and immediately took up a firing position next to Wheeler. "Took you long enough?" Wheeler grunted a grin, fighting its way through the dirt on his face. Cassie wiped the blood from her eye and checked her magazine. "Traffic was a nightmare, boss. How's Sullivan?" "Breathing. Thanks to you," Russo called out from the back, applying a fresh pressure dressing. The arrival of the A-10, its devastating gun runs, and its catastrophic trench-clearing crash had entirely broken the enemy's spirit. The surviving insurgents were retreating, fleeing back into the caves and tunnels of the Hindu Kush. 45 minutes later, the first rays of dawn began to peek over the jagged mountains. And with the dawn, the dust storm finally died. The distinctive heavy thwack-thwack-thwack of rotor blades filled the valley. 2 MH-47 Chinook helicopters, escorted by a pair of fully armed Apache gunships, flared over the valley floor, kicking up a massive dust cloud as they touched down near the burning wreckage of the A-10. The QRF had arrived. As the pararescue men rushed out with stretchers to load Sullivan and the other wounded, Captain Cole stepped off the ramp of the lead Chinook. He wore full tactical gear, his face thunderous as he surveyed the battlefield. He looked at the shattered enemy positions, the smoking crater where the recoilless rifle used to be, and finally the smoldering corpse of the ghost ship. Then he looked at Cassie. She was standing with Wheeler and the remaining operators of Team 4, her flight suit, torn and bloodied, an M4, slung over her shoulder. Cole marched up to her. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a combat knife. Technically, Cassie had stolen a multi-million-dollar military asset, disobeyed direct orders, broken flight protocols, and destroyed an aircraft. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Cole said, his voice cold. "You stole a condemned aircraft." "Yes, sir," Cassie replied, snapping to attention. "You disobeyed a direct order from your commanding officer." "Yes, sir." Cole stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He looked past her to Master Chief Wheeler. "Setiwat of was." Wheeler stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the captain. "If you're going to court-martial Lieutenant Mitchell, you'll have to court-martial all 32 of us, because as of right now, she is the only reason we are breathing. She is Team 4. The other SEALs stepped up, forming a physical wall around Cassie. Exhausted, bleeding, and bruised, they stood shoulder to shoulder with the pilot who had plummeted from the sky to fight in the mud with them. Captain Cole looked at the grim, unyielding faces of the Tier 1 operators. He let out a long exhale, the anger draining from his shoulders. He reached into his vest, pulled out a notepad, and clicked his pen. "I don't know what you're talking about, Master Chief," Cole said loudly, making sure the entire landing zone heard him. "According to my official report, a sudden microburst of wind dragged an unsecured, decommissioned A-10 off the tarmac and into a ravine. As for Lieutenant Mitchell, she was simply on a permitted foot patrol and arrived just in time to assist with extraction." He looked at Cassie, a faint glimmer of profound respect in his eyes. "Good work, SEAL. Now get your brothers on the bird. We're going home." Cassie smiled a fierce, weary smile and turned to help O'Connor carry their gear to the waiting helicopter. She had traded the sky for the dirt, and in doing so, she hadn't just saved 32 men. She had proven that no matter the odds, no matter the orders, you never leave a brother behind. Cassie Mitchell proved that true courage isn't about following the rules. It's about doing whatever it takes to protect your team, even if it means flying a broken jet into hell. Her legendary defiance saved 32 lives. Did this intense true story of loyalty and bravery give you chills? Hit that like button, share this incredible mission with your friends, and subscribe for more epic battlefield stories.